The night of August 31st, 1939, passed with unbearable slowness for those who knew what morning would bring. In the small Polish border town of Wieluń, 70-year-old Franciszek Kowalski couldn't sleep. He sat by his kitchen window, smoking his pipe, watching the stars fade. His grandson, Piotr, slept upstairs, just 17, with his whole life ahead of him. Franciszek had lived through the partitions of Poland, had celebrated when independence finally came in 1918. Now, in his old age, he felt the terrible weight of history about to repeat itself. Across the border in Germany, Hauptmann Klaus Weber of the Luftwaffe checked his watch for the 100th time. 4:30 would come soon enough. He was 42, a veteran of the Great War, and he'd flown his first combat mission at 19. Back then they'd called it the war to end all wars. What fools they'd been. His hands trembled slightly as he climbed into his Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The younger pilots were excited, eager. Klaus felt only a deep, gnawing dread. In Warsaw, Jan Kowalski, no relation to the Franciszek in Wieluń, worked late in his small printing shop. At 58, he'd built a good life. His newspaper had spoken cautiously about the gathering storm, always walking a tightrope between truth and prudence. His wife, Maria, brought him tea at midnight. "Come to bed," she urged. "Whatever happens will happen whether you sleep or not." But Jan couldn't leave. He was setting type for what he somehow knew would be the most important edition of his life. Franciszek Kowalski was still at his window when he heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. Then he saw them, dark shapes against the brightening sky, flying in formation. For a moment he thought they might pass over. Then came the whistle of falling bombs. The first bomb struck the hospital. The second hit the town square. Wieluń, a town of no military significance whatsoever, was chosen deliberately, a test of German air power, a message of terror, to send through Poland. Of the town's 16,000 inhabitants, 1,200 would die in the next few hours. Franciszek threw himself to the floor as his windows exploded inward. Glass rained down like deadly snow. When he staggered to his feet, his ears ringing, he could hear screaming. He stumbled up the stairs, calling for Piotr. The boy emerged, eyes wide with shock. "Grandfather, what's happening?" "War," Franciszek said simply. "Get dressed. We need to help." Outside, the world had transformed into hell. Buildings burned, bodies lay in the streets. Women in nightgowns, children who'd been running to shelters. Franciszek had seen war before, but nothing like this. This was war from the sky, war that didn't distinguish between soldier and civilian, between military target and home. Klaus Weber pulled out of his dive, his bomb released. Below, he could see the fires starting. "Good hit, Herr Hauptmann," his young gunner shouted through the intercom. Klaus didn't respond. He'd been told this was a military target. From up here, it looked like any small town. It looked like the town where he'd grown up. At exactly the same moment, the bombs fell on Wieluń. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, supposedly on a courtesy visit to Gdansk, opened fire on the Polish military depot at Westerplatte. The first shells screamed through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:45 a.m. precisely. Sergeant Major Wojciech Nysarek, 45 years old, had been awake for hours. He'd known it was coming. They all had. The garrison at Westerplatte numbered just 182 men. German intelligence estimated they could be overcome in hours. Wojciech and his men would prove them catastrophically wrong. But in that first moment, as the shells burst around them, all he could think was, "So it begins again." Along the Polish-German border, hundreds of kilometers long, the invasion rolled forward like a mechanical tide. Panzers rumbled across bridges. Infantry marched in perfect formation. And everywhere, the Luftwaffe roared overhead, bombing roads, railways, bridges, communication lines, and towns like Wieluń, where there was nothing military to bomb at all. At the little border town of Mokra, the Polish Volhynian Cavalry Brigade, under Colonel Stefan Majewski, waited in prepared positions. At 51, the colonel was one of the oldest field commanders in the Polish army. He'd fought the Russians in 1920, when Poland had beaten back the Red Army in what many called the miracle on the Vistula. Now he faced Germany's 4th Panzer Division. When the panzers came, many in the world expected the Polish cavalry to charge them with lances like something from the Middle Ages. It was a myth that would persist for decades, spread by German propaganda. In reality, Colonel Majewski's men fought from prepared positions with anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine guns. His cavalry dismounted and fought as infantry, as they'd trained to do, and they fought magnificently. "Hold this ground," Majewski told his officers. "Every hour we hold is an hour for Warsaw to prepare. Every German we stop here is one less they can send to our capital." They held Mokra for an entire day. They destroyed dozens of tanks. They proved that Poland would not simply roll over, but it was only one small victory in a tide of defeats. The first bombs fell on Warsaw at 6 a.m. Jan Kowalski was still at his printing shop when the windows rattled. He ran outside and saw smoke rising from the direction of the airfield. People poured into the streets, confused, frightened, demanding to know what was happening. By 8 o'clock, Jan had the morning edition ready. Germany invades, Poland at war. It sold out in minutes. People clustered around radios and cafes and shops in the streets. At 11 a.m., they heard what they'd been waiting for, an announcement that Britain and France, Poland's allies, would surely declare war on Germany. Help was coming, but no such announcement came. Britain and France were still deliberating, still hoping somehow this could be resolved. Poland stood alone. Jan's daughter, Zofia, worked as a nurse at the Saxon hospital. She was 32, unmarried, devoted to her work. When the first wounded arrived, civilians from the bombed neighborhoods, she understood immediately that this war would be different from anything her father had described from 1914. This war made no distinction between battlefield and home. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, was carried in by her father. She'd been playing in her garden when a bomb landed 3 houses away. The blast had peppered her with shrapnel. As Zofia worked to save the child's life, she heard the father weeping, saying over and over, "We were just in our garden." Just our garden. What kind of war is this? At 10 a.m., Adolf Hitler addressed the Reichstag in Berlin. He wore not his usual party uniform, but a simple military field gray uniform. "I am asking of no German man anything more than I myself was ready throughout 4 years at any time to do," he declared, referring to his service in the Great War. He claimed that Poland had attacked Germany, a lie so transparent it would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so tragic. The attack he referenced was a false flag operation. SS men dressed in Polish uniforms had attacked a German radio station the night before, leaving bodies of concentration camp prisoners dressed as Polish soldiers as evidence. In London, Winston Churchill, not yet Prime Minister, but serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, listened to the translation of Hitler's speech with mounting fury. He'd been warning about this for years, called a warmonger and an alarmist. Now he was proven right, but he took no satisfaction in it. "The Nazi regime has chosen war," he would write that night. "Very well, they shall have it, and they shall learn what British and French power, joined with Polish courage, can do." But that would come later. On September 1st, Poland fought alone. By afternoon, the magnitude of the disaster was becoming clear. The Polish Air Force, outdated and outnumbered, was fighting valiantly, but being destroyed. The Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority in hours. Now, German planes roamed freely over Polish skies, bombing and strafing at will, roads filled with refugees, farmers abandoned their fields, townspeople fled cities. And along the roads, German pilots, some reluctant, some eager, strafed columns of civilians. Klaus Weber, returning from his third mission of the day, saw it happening. A young pilot in his squadron, barely 20 years old, had descended to strafe what he claimed was a military convoy. Klaus, flying higher, could see they were civilian carts and wagons. "Break off!" he shouted over the radio. "Those are civilians." "The orders are to create chaos in the enemy rear," the young pilot responded. "These orders come from the highest authority." Klaus said nothing more. What could he say? He'd seen this coming, had told himself he would refuse illegal orders, would stand up for what was right. But now, in the moment, he found himself silent. It would haunt him for the rest of his life, which would not be long. He would die over Britain in 1940, shot down by a Spitfire. His last words over the radio would be, "I'm sorry." As darkness fell on September 1st, 1939, the shape of the war to come was already visible to those with eyes to see. This would not be a war of trenches and stalemate like the Great War. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast, brutal, overwhelming. In Wieluń, Franciszek Kowalski sat in what remained of his home, his grandson beside him. They'd spent the day helping pull survivors from rubble, carrying wounded to overwhelmed hospitals, burying the dead. Piotr's hands were blistered and bloody. His eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much, too quickly. "Why did they bomb us, grandfather?" he asked. "We're nobody, just a little town. No soldiers, no factories." "Why?" Franciszek had no answer. The truth that they'd been bombed precisely because they were nobody, to spread terror, seemed too cruel to speak aloud. "War makes men into monsters," he said finally. "Remember this day, Piotr. Remember what war really means, so that when you're my age, you'll do everything in your power to prevent it from happening again." Piotr would survive the war. He would fight in the resistance, be captured, survive a concentration camp, and live to be 93. He would tell his story to anyone who would listen, always beginning with, "I was 17 years old when the first bombs fell on September 1st, 1939. In Warsaw, Jan Kowalski worked through the night on the next day's edition. The news was all bad. German forces advancing on multiple fronts, cities bombed, casualties mounting, and still no word from Britain and France. But Jan made sure his paper also carried stories of resistance, of Polish soldiers fighting with extraordinary courage, of a nation that would not surrender without a fight. His daughter, Zofia, came home at midnight, her nurse's uniform stained with blood. She collapsed into a chair, too exhausted even to change. "We ran out of anesthesia," she said quietly. "We performed surgeries with vodka for pain relief." "Children, Papa, so many children." Jan held his daughter as she wept. Outside, they could hear the distant rumble of explosions. German bombers were returning for a night raid. The city lights were out, but fires illuminated the sky. This was the new reality. War from the air, war that came to your home, war that made no distinction between soldier and civilian. "We won't win, will we?" Zofia asked. Jan wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but he'd built his life on truth. "No," he said, "we won't. Germany is too strong, too prepared. We're on our own, and our army, brave as it is, isn't equipped for this kind of war." "Then why fight?" "Because surrender without resistance means the death of the soul," Jan said. "Because our allies will remember who stood and who fell. Because the world must see that Poland will not go quietly into that dark night. And because, my darling daughter, we fight so that someday, maybe not in our lifetime, but someday, Poland will be free again." At Mokra, Colonel Majewski's cavalry brigade had held far longer than anyone expected. They'd inflicted serious casualties on the 4th Panzer Division, but by nightfall they were nearly out of ammunition, and German reinforcements were arriving. "We'll withdraw tonight," Majewski told his officers. "We'll fall back, regroup, and fight again tomorrow. Every day we resist is a victory." Among his men was a 38-year-old cavalry captain named Witold Pilecki. He would survive this first battle and the battles that followed. When Poland finally fell, he would join the resistance. In 1940, he would voluntarily enter Auschwitz to gather intelligence and organize resistance inside the camp. One of the most extraordinary acts of courage in a war filled with them. But on this first night, he was simply a tired soldier, checking on his men, sharing his own meager rations with the youngest cavalryman. "Will we win, Captain?" a boy of 19 asked him. Pilecki considered lying. Instead, he chose inspiration. "We'll win what matters," he said. "We'll win our honor. We'll win the respect of the world. We'll prove that Poland cannot be simply erased. The Germans have their tanks and planes. We have something they don't understand and never will, a cause worth dying for." Not all of Poland's defenders wore uniforms. Józef Kowalczyk, yes, another Kowalski, Kowalczyk, these being among the most common Polish surnames, was 62 years old and owned a small farm near Łódź. He'd fought in 1920 against the Bolsheviks. Now he was too old for the regular army, but not too old to fight. When German troops approached his farm late on September 1st, Józef was ready. He had his great war rifle, cleaned and oiled, and a good hiding spot in his barn. When a German motorcycle courier stopped to check a map, Józef shot him. He took the man's papers, his weapon, and his motorcycle, and he brought them to the nearest Polish military unit. It wasn't much. One German soldier dead wouldn't change the course of the war. But multiply Józef by thousands, by tens of thousands, and you begin to understand why the German occupation of Poland would never be easy, why resistance would flourish, why the Polish spirit could not be crushed no matter how many tanks rolled across the border. That night, Józef buried the German soldier in his field. "I'm sorry," he said over the grave. "You were somebody's son. But you came to conquer my country, and I'll be damned before I let that happen without a fight." In London, the government agonized over what to do. They'd guaranteed Poland's independence. They'd promised to come to her aid if Germany attacked. But how? The British army was small, unprepared for a continental war. The French, behind their Maginot Line, were defensive-minded. There was no way to get help to Poland quickly enough to matter. 78-year-old Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, spent September 1st in emergency meetings. He'd tried to avoid this war, had believed Hitler could be reasoned with. Now he understood his error, but understanding came too late for Poland. "We must declare war," Winston Churchill argued forcefully. "We gave our word. British honor demands it." "And then what?" someone asked. "How do we help Poland?" Churchill had no answer. The brutal truth was that Poland was doomed the moment German tanks crossed the border. Britain and France could declare war, and they would 2 days later, but they couldn't save Poland. The best they could offer was revenge later, and the promise that Poland's sacrifice would be remembered and ultimately avenged. An elderly backbench MP who'd fought in the Boer War 40 years earlier spoke up, "Gentlemen, I've seen Britain enter 2 wars in my lifetime. Each time we told ourselves it would be quick, that right would prevail easily. I fear this will be longer and bloodier than anything we've yet seen." But the alternative, allowing Hitler to swallow Europe piece by piece, is unthinkable. Poland falls today. If we do nothing, who falls tomorrow? Back in Wieluń, as the first day of the war ended, Franciszek Kowalski and his grandson searched for relatives. Franciszek's daughter, Piotr's mother, had been visiting a friend across town. They found her alive, sheltering in a cellar, but her friend was dead, killed by a bomb fragment while trying to save her cat. Such small, absurd tragedies would define this war. Millions would die, but each death was individual, personal, irreplaceable. An old woman who died trying to save her cat. A child killed playing in a garden. A young soldier shot on his first day in combat. Each one a universe extinguished. "How many died today?" Piotr asked his grandfather as they walked home through streets lit by burning buildings. "In Wieluń?" "More than 1,000, I think. In all of Poland?" Franciszek shook his head. "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, and this is just the first day." "How long will the war last?" Franciszek looked at his grandson, so young, so suddenly aged by what he'd witnessed. "Years," he said. "This war will last years, and it will change the world forever." He was right. The war would last 2,194 days. By the time it ended, somewhere between 70 and 85 million people would be dead, about 3% of the entire world's population. Poland would lose 6 million of its citizens, 17% of its pre-war population. Warsaw, the beautiful city where John Kowalski printed his newspaper, would be 85% destroyed. The world would learn new words: blitzkrieg, Holocaust, genocide, nuclear bomb. But all of that was still to come. On September 1st, 1939, it was just the first day. A day when the sun rose on an uneasy peace and set on a world at war. As midnight approached, marking the end of the first day of World War II, Jan Kowalski finally left his printing shop. The streets of Warsaw were dark. Blackout regulations were already in effect. He could hear the sound of anti-aircraft guns in the distance. Another night raid was underway. He thought about the edition he'd just printed, the words "Poland at War" in the largest type he had. He'd included casualty reports, military communiques, and, perhaps most importantly, a list of air raid shelters. His newspaper, which had focused on politics and culture and local gossip, was now about survival. Walking home, he passed a young couple holding each other on a street corner, crying. A group of old men stood outside a cafe, smoking and arguing about whether Britain and France would really honor their commitments. A mother hurried past, pulling 3 children along, heading for a shelter. This was Warsaw's new normal, arrived in a single day. At home, he found Maria and Sophia asleep, exhausted. He sat at his kitchen table and allowed himself, finally, to feel the full weight of what had happened. The world he'd known, the hard-won peace after the Great War, the independent Poland he'd celebrated, was gone. A new world, darker and more terrible, had taken its place. But Jan Kowalski was 58 years old, and he'd seen troubles before. He would print his paper every day the city stood. He would report the truth as he saw it. And when the Germans finally came to Warsaw, when they occupied the city and shut down independent papers, he would print underground newsletters. He would resist in the way he knew best, with words, with truth, with the stubborn insistence that a free press was worth dying for. He would die in 1943, shot by the Gestapo for printing resistance materials.